So, as I said in earlier screencasts, um, you can make a pretty solid argument that most of the ecologic problems that the world faces, whether it be global warming, polluted water, whatever it happens to be, it mostly comes down to a problem of human population growth. So, as there's more and more people on the planet, they need more and more energy, which puts more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They need more and more food, so we have to deforest more land and reduce biodiversity and grow more food and lose more soil and on and on and on. So all these problems really come down to population. And for the duration of human history, that population has been increasing. It's been really increasing since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution and really, really increasing since the end of World War II. But the good news is it's starting to change in a positive way, meaning it's not growing as fast and maybe even coming down a little bit, but that's not true in all places. So it's very much uh, in the interest of people who are concerned with environmental science to understand the factors that affect human population growth. So that's what we're going to focus on today. Now, if you're going to understand human population growth, the first thing you got to understand is it's women who have babies. And so, in order to understand how populations change in terms of growth trends, we have to look at the female portion of a society because they're the ones who have the babies. So, surprise, surprise, what we find is where population tends to be very high, if you study the culture, what you find is the women tend to have a lot of babies. Uh, if you look at countries where the population is stable or even shrinking, what you find is women have fewer babies. And also, it's when in their lives they have those babies. So there's many factors that are going to contribute to how many children a woman have and when in her life she has them. And by understanding these variables, we can perhaps implement some sort of policies, either nationally or globally, that could hopefully uh, uh, allow us to prevent any population or the whole population from having an overshoot and then dieback, which would be catastrophic. And that's definitely in our interest to prevent. Now, the most important measure we have in this case is what we call TFR, total fertility rate. And simply put, it's just how many babies does a woman have in the course of her lifetime? All right. So let's just look at this. I'll give you an example. And it shouldn't be surprising that uh, in countries where the TFR is higher, where the average woman in the course of her life has more babies, you should expect the population to grow faster. Whoops, didn't mean for that to happen. And in countries where the women have fewer babies, you expect the population to grow at a slow rate. So just look at this. So my mother's mother had 9 children. My mother had 6 children. I'm the last one, so good job, mom. I'm glad you didn't stop. uh, and then my sister. I have 3 sisters. 2 of them had no children, and one of them had 1 children. Okay, so you definitely see that as a society develops, there can be a change in TFR. And but we're really not talking about individual when we're talking about the overall TFR of a country is what we want to measure in terms of understanding why and how we're getting growth. So what we find is countries that have high TFR, women having many children in the course of their lifetime, this is the characteristic of those countries, okay? So it tends to be a very high rate of infant mortality and childhood mortality, basically meaning that there's not a lot of nutrition. There's not a lot of food availability. There's not a lot of good nutrition availability. There's not a lot of medical assistance available to these people. So when their children get sick with childhood illnesses, they're not getting uh, uh, medical support. We tend to find that these countries have economies that are based on what we call subsistence farming, or subsistence agriculture. Basically, what that means is each family unit is supporting themselves by growing food on a plot of land. So you have a small piece of land that you and your family work, and that's how you feed yourselves. And so you can see if that's the case, having more children is going to help because that means there's more people to help you, plant the crops, care for them, get rid of pests, pull weeds, whatever. So there's definitely an incentive in that case to have a large family. And especially if some of them are expected to die because you don't have good medical care. Another thing we find, and this is a really important one, especially in terms of giving us an insight into how we can try to remedy the situation in countries that have out of control growth, is we notice that in these countries, girls tend to not get educated. Boys often don't either, but generally speaking, women in these countries are far less likely to get educated than males are. And as a consequence, since they're not going to high school or college, they tend to get married very young, like in their mid-teens, like at 15, 16 years old, they're getting married and starting to have children. And basically, why? Well, because they don't have economic opportunities outside of the home. Their role in society is to basically, I mean, I don't mean to make this sound bad, but like to be baby producers. Their status in their society is by having babies. Like this woman that we're looking at here at the bottom here. So, the woman in Uganda, she had 44 children, and you know what? That's seen as a good thing in that culture, right? Having lots of babies means you're a good mother, that you're very productive. But if you step back and look at what that means for Rwanda overall, it's not a good thing. And so basically, the women don't have a way of making money outside the home, so they don't. They just stay home and raise children. Another thing we find in these countries is either there isn't an availability of contraception and family planning services, or it's actually discouraged for cultural or religious reasons. And as I said earlier, so the woman's status is higher if she has more children. And we find in developing countries, it is common to see all of these or most of these present. And for that reason, we find developing countries tend to be the ones that have the highest TFR and have the fastest population growth rates and the greatest looming catastrophes in terms of overshooting the carrying capacity of their country. Now, what if we look at countries that have low TFR? Well, you shouldn't be surprised to find it's just the opposite. So a classic example of a country with low TFR is right here in Korea. So we find is there tends to be a very low rate of infant and childhood mortality. If you have a child, the expectation is that child's probably going to live to be an adult. Unfortunately, sometimes that doesn't happen, but in most cases it does. Unlike in these developing countries where it's not at all uncommon for children to die. I had a friend. She was working. She was a biologist. She was working in sub-Saharan Africa in this remote village where they didn't even name their children until they got to be about 2 years old because the expectation was they weren't going to live anyway. I mean, that's how bad it can be. Now, in countries where the TFR is low, we tend to find that the economy is not based on subsistence farming. Instead, is based on skilled services and industry. So you need a high school or higher education in order to make it in that society. So because education, including college education, is a requirement, that tends to postpone birth, which makes the TFR low. If you get started later in life, you're going to have less children. Then, and we also find in these countries is that girls tend to receive the same education as boys. Now, that doesn't mean everything is completely equal. There's still gender disparity in almost any country you look at, but it tends to be much less in these countries. And rather than getting married and starting having children when they're 15 or 16 years old, they tend to wait till their mid 20s or even into their mid 30s before they start becoming mothers. And the reason is because they have economic opportunities outside the home. So the expectation is, you're a girl in this country, you can get educated, you can become a high paid salaried person at a corporation. So you're sort of building your own career, and then at some point that biological clock kicks in. You're like, but you know what? I want to have children too. So that basically greatly delays the rate at which women are having babies. So they have fewer in the course of their lifetime, a lower TFR. And how are they able to keep from having babies? In these countries, contraception and family planning services are widely available. So women have children because they choose to have children, not just a simple consequence of sexual union with their husbands. So this is what we notice where we have countries with low TFRs. So let's just look at a graph here, okay? So if I have, uh, whoops, yeah, okay. So here, let's just look at the role of when a woman has her child. So in both cases, we're going to have women in a country that have a TFR of 3. So the average number of children in this country is 3, right? Which is it's a little bit on the high side, okay? But look at the difference here. Here, the average age of marriage is 16. Here, the average age is 26. And look at the difference it can have on the growth rate of the population. And because it's simply the sooner you have babies, the sooner your babies have babies, and so on. So one of the greatest things you can do to reduce the population growth is get women to wait to have their children. And the best way to do that is to educate them. Then there's a concept called replacement fertility rate, which is an interesting concept because it leads to a little bit of concern in countries, like Japan and Korea. Replacement fertility rate is what is the minimum amount of TFR that's needed in order to keep a population from not growing or shrinking, just keep it at equilibrium. And in developed countries where there is good access to medical care and the children don't typically die, what we find is the TFR replacement fertility rate is 2.1. And why 2.1? Because in order to keep the population constant, a woman has to have one baby to replace herself, one baby to replace her husband. So you think, well, why isn't it two? Well, because not every child is going to survive to reproductive age. Not every child is going to choose to have children. Some children are going to be homosexual. Some children just choose not. Like my mom had 6 children. 3 of her children just chose not to have children. Uh, so, so what we find a general value is about 2.1. It can be a little bit higher in developing countries where there is higher infant mortality, childhood mortality. In those countries, in order to maintain a population of a certain size, women have to have more than 2.1 children. But let's look at this here. So what we've got is if TFR was 3 in a developed country, we would expect a trend like this. If TFR is 2.1, that's replacement fertility rate, we tend to have a constant population. It's an equilibrium. And if the TFR is less than that, if it's below replacement fertility rate, then our expectation is the population will begin to decline in size. And we see this in many countries now. So the next thing we want to look at is what's called an age structure diagram. These things are quite telling and kind of cool, really. So an age structure diagram is a great tool that we're going to use to investigate what we'd anticipate happening in a society, where that's, what are the cultural norms of that society, what the economy of the society. It can all be inferred from these age structure diagrams. So in an age structure diagram, typically speaking, the x-axis is going to be the percent of the population. It's usually divided between the left side being male and the right side being female. I'm not really sure why they do that, but they often, because sometimes, you can have lopsided curves there. You'll often notice that the women live longer. But anyway, but the most important thing to know is, apart from that, the x-axis is typically the percent of the population. The y-axis is divided up into 5-year increments. So from 0 to 4, 5 to 9, 10 to 14, 15 to 19, and so on, all the way up until 80 plus. And by doing this, by presenting the data in this format, we get a sense of whether a population can be expected to grow in the future, to stay constant, or shrink. So before we go further, we should talk about 3 general regions of these graphs, okay? So the ages from 0 to 14 are considered to be the pre-reproductive years, meaning that people in this region here are not reproducing yet. They're going to, as they get older, they'll move from here to here and they'll start reproducing. But if we notice, there's a lot of people who are too young to reproduce. We know in the next 14 years, they're going to be reproducing. Ages 15 to 44 are considered to be the reproductive years, and when people are having children. And then from 45 and up, it's very unusual for women to have children. So we call these the post-reproductive years. So those are the 3 regions: pre-reproductive, reproductive, post-reproductive. So what we can do now is we can look at the shapes of these age structure diagrams, and we can make some inferences based on these. Okay, so let's just see how we would do that. So if we look at the pre-reproductive part of the population, and we notice that it's larger, it comes out farther. So the base of the pyramid comes out farther than the reproductive group ahead of it. Well, what does that mean? That means as time goes by, there's going to be a larger number of people reproducing. Well, if you have a large number of people reproducing, your population rate is going to go up, right? So you're going to increase the rate at which the population grows. So we see this, we can just look at it and make an inference like, wow, you've got a lot of people in this region of your graph. You're going to be growing in the future. Even if you're not growing now, you're going to grow in the future. Now, if we look and we see, well, the percentage of the people who are pre-reproductive is just slightly larger than the people who are reproductive. Well, then what we know is that your rate of growth is probably slowing down. It's still growing, maybe 1%, 1.5%. It's still growing. It's just not growing explosively. Then we see ones where it's completely straight-sided or almost completely straight-sided, almost looks like a building. Okay, so when we see this, what that tells us is you have about the same number of people or percentage of people who are pre-reproductive as those who are reproductive. So if I just move this up, what we're going to find is that we would not expect the population to get bigger. It's just going to replace itself. So when we see these straight-sided age structure diagrams, what we infer is, oh, well, if things stay this way, this population is going to remain where it is. It's not going to get bigger. It's not going to get smaller. But in recent decades, a new type of age structure diagram has begun to emerge, and it looks like this. To be honest, it kind of looks like a coffin, doesn't it? But that's okay. Don't worry. It's not a scary thing. Basically, what happens is if we have fewer people in their pre-reproductive years, then as time goes by, there's going to be fewer people in their reproductive years, and if they're presumably the TFR stays constant, then that means that the population is going to shrink in that case. So basically, shrinking population, constant population, mildly growing population, rapidly growing population. All right, so let's just dig in a little bit deeper. Okay, so when I see an age structure diagram like this, right, this is one where I have a very wide base that gets out to like 8 or 10% of the population might be in that first category, 0 to 4. So we have a very wide base and we have concave sides, right? So when we see that, we know we've got a country that has very rapid population growth, 3, 4, 5, 6% or more. We know that the women probably have a high TFR. They're having a lot of children. They're having them young. The women are probably not getting educated if they're having a lot of babies and they're having them so young. So we can if I look at this, I go, you know what? This is probably a developing country, probably based on subsistence agriculture. The women in this culture don't have access to education. They probably don't have much in the way of healthcare. And they probably have pretty high infant mortality rate, childhood mortality rate. They probably don't have much in the way of medical care or other infrastructure in their society. So you can just infer all of that by looking at this age structure diagram going, I recognize that one. Wide base and concave sides. I know what we've got here. We've got a developing nation that has all these impediments to the help, to reducing its population growth. And I just want to say, this is not to put any kind of judgment on that or anything like that. It's just like if we want, understanding that population growth presents a problem to the future of our planet and the people in it, it's certainly worth knowing like what needs to happen in order to transition out of that type of age structure. So if we look at one like this, it's not concave anymore, or maybe it almost looks like a Thai dancer's hat. Okay, so it's got like this. When we start to see this sort of shape, this tells us that we've got a country that is starting to transition out of being a developing country and becoming a developed country. Do you know what that means? Is you're moving away from subsistence agriculture into an industrial type of society. So what's happening is people are moving out of the farms and they're moving into cities, and they're renting houses, or apartments. They're getting salaried jobs, and so when that happens, people start having fewer children. The TFR goes down. Infant mortality also goes down because if you're in a city, it's easy to provide. Even in a country that's not particularly wealthy, there's still going to be services available in a city to provide healthcare. If you have a sick child in a city, it's a lot easier to get them seen than if you're in some remote village way out in the middle of nowhere. And the other thing is, usually when we see this happening, it means that when you move into the city, there's more schools and there's often opportunities. Unless there's strong cultural resistance to it, there's probably going to be opportunities for girls to become educated. They're not seen as the vessels for filling their farm with workers. They're just another member of the family, and we're worried about their future, and their future is not linked to making babies to work the land. Instead, it's just about trying to find economic opportunities for her. So you want her to get educated. So when I see this, I know like your TFR is dropping and you're transitioning away from being a developed country into being a developing country into a developed country. So when I see this, straight sides like this, as I said before, this tells me that the population is really not growing. It's stabilized now. And when we see this, that tells us that the TFR has reached replacement fertility level of 2.1. There's probably very low infant mortality, very low childhood mortality. There's good access to health services, to food. The economy in a country like this is not going to be agricultural anymore. It's going to be based mostly on manufacturing and services. When we say services, that means like developing software and stuff like that. And I look at a city graph like this. I look at most of the people here living in the cities, and the women are getting educated and they're having opportunity to participate in the economy after they get educated. There are economic opportunities for them in the workforce. And then when I see this, when I see one with a narrower base, so it's smaller at the bottom than it is above it, this is what we call a post-industrial country. In other words, they're no longer based on manufacturing. We see this all the time. So, when I was a child, China, had a population going out of control. It was subsistence farming, and there was a lot of hunger there. And then they made a transition over time, and then for a while there, like everything was made in China. Well, then they moved more into the services, and now instead of being made in China, things were being made in, say, Bangladesh or Taiwan or Sri Lanka. And so as time goes by, there'll be less and less manufacturing and more service. By that I mean like financial, people working as bankers, people working as software designers, and so on. So when you see this, it generally means that the economy has, first of all, is shrinking because the bottom is smaller than above it. The TFR is below replacement level, and that is no longer even an industrial economy; it's a post-industrial economy. And in a post-industrial economy, you can't just go to high school and get a job. You can't just put rivets on an airplane or whatever. You've got to get educated and be able to provide some sort of very, very highly targeted, basically, what would I say? Like, so you have like an economic niche you're trying to fill, right? Like all of you, right? You're all like figuring out, where am I going to make my way in the society? I'm going to become an economist. I'm going to become a software developer. I'm going to become a doctor, right? So in order to do that, you need education, right? So when I see an age-structure diagram like this, you realize, like, in this society, education is really important. Well, education is really expensive, so people, they tend to have fewer children because it's expensive to pay for them. And it's also usually expensive to house people because these cities are ones that are very desirable, so everybody wants to live there. And as a consequence, people just tend to stop having children, like here in Korea, where people have less than 2.1 children. Uh, and what we find in these is that women are very educated, and they generally wait until they are either close to or over 30 to have that first child. And often they only have that one child. I'm sure many of you are only children. That's definitely the trend in these post-industrial countries. Now, if we look at the age structure diagram of the world as a whole, this is what we see, right? So what we see is it's not quite straight up and down. So the TFR globally is a little bit more than 2.1. There is some population growth. Right now, it's at about 1.1%. It used to be higher. When I was your age, it was considerably higher than that. But now here's the thing to look at that's really shocking. To me, this is the most shocking thing I'm going to show you today. And that is, if we look at population growth in developing countries versus developed countries, right? What we see is this. The population after World War II, it really began to grow in pretty much all countries. But then what happened was, as the developed countries moved into industrial and post-industrial stages, their populations stabilized. But the world population didn't, because in developed nations, it just kept climbing. So unfortunately, these poor developed nations, they're the ones that are going to bear the brunt of this looming disaster if they outpace their ability to provide food, which they're getting to right now. And most of these countries happen to be in sub-Saharan Africa. So here's a map of global population growth. You notice that in Europe, we tend to have a lot of countries. In Japan, I don't know why this doesn't seem accurate. I think South Korea should be here. We have negative population growth, like the population is shrinking. But if we look in sub-Saharan Africa and certain parts of the Middle East, and some parts of South Asia. What we notice is there's quite a bit of population growth. I mean, 5% population growth, 4 to 5% population growth. That's alarming, right? When you have that, you end up with this. Okay, so the region of the world where this problem is occurring, it's regionalized. It's here and a little bit here, and so those are the countries where this tragedy of overshooting the carrying capacity is likely to happen. And so, how are we going to keep this from happening? Well, the best strategy to reduce human population is really to help countries move and transition from being a developing country to being a developed country, right? So, and there's things we can do, the UN can do, different nations can do to assist in this, right? So basically, you try to get people to move from being subsistence farming based economy to being an industrial economy, manufacturing, build things, all right? Uh, you help them develop an infrastructure. So that means like roads, hospitals, banks, things that are stable and things you can count on. Hospitalizations. So we want to have an infrastructure that is reliable. When you have a reliable infrastructure, people trust it, and then good things happen. You need to help them develop a quality education system where all citizens, including girls, can get educated so they can take on these industrial jobs rather than just working on farms. And you've got to provide access to contraceptives because, the only way a woman can, people are going to, if people get married, they're going to have sex, and you want it to be possible for women to choose how many children should be in their family. And that means you must provide access to contraceptives. Unfortunately, in a lot of the countries that we're looking at that diagram, there's some pushback. Okay, so there are these obstacles that they face that makes it a challenge. Otherwise, it would have been fixed by now. Okay, so here's the challenges that we're up against. Most of the countries that have these population growth problems have very unstable political systems. So you've got warlords, you've got frequent coups. You have a government that's constantly going from one extreme to another. There's always these civil wars happening, and as a result, if you have all this internal conflict, it's very unlikely that you're going to have any kind of stable infrastructure. You also often have these corrupt leaders who took over by military force. It's not democratic, and so if the UN gives them money, a lot of times they just, instead of helping the people with it, they just enrich themselves. So a lot of the well-intentioned aid that goes to these countries ends up in the pockets of these corrupt leaders. Uh, Often, too, these in these countries, these corrupt political leaders, they don't want their populace to be educated because an educated populace might turn against them. So they unfortunately see it as advantageous to keep them poor and working on farms so that these corrupt leaders can maintain their control on power. And then finally, and this one's probably the most difficult of all, is religious and traditional beliefs. And people often become radicalized when you try to push against that, right? And it's really tricky because you don't really feel right saying to somebody your religion is telling you the wrong thing. I mean, that's like not really cool. And yet, what we find is that this is often, in a lot of these cases, these traditional religious values or just traditions themselves that are apart from religion, um, they often have a component in them in which women are seen as second-class citizens, like subservient to men, and that there's often a viewing of contraception as being empowering of women, and we don't want that. And so that's a really hard thing to try to push against. So, in order to get the world to slow its population down, is countries have these problems we got to find a way around. And there's lots that can be done. There's lots of really smart people who've been working on this for a long time, and they've made great progress over the years. But the battle's far from over, and hopefully, maybe some of you will make this your call in life. So I'm sorry this is a long one, but it's an important one. Thanks for listening. How do I turn this off? Try and make it stop.